My earliest memories of the Vietnam War are the first time I remember anything political happening in the household. I was a little girl in elementary school and then middle school throughout the war, and I remember becoming aware that my parents disagreed with each other about the war, and this was just prior to the election of LBJ. And my mother was a pacifist. She wore a button that had this logo on it and got them for all of us kids. There were 3 of us. My older brother is 6 years older than I am, and he was getting close to 18 and eligible for the draft. My father was a World War II veteran who fought in the 4th Armored Division, and he was completely supportive of the military and felt that my brother should go to Vietnam should he be drafted, and my mother was dead set against this. She became very, very politically active in our local community outside of New York City, and I remember this poster being up in the kitchen and bumper stickers on the cars, and my father and she having real knockdown verbal fights about the responsibility of someone to go to war if their country chooses to. The next memories I have are of the March on Washington. My mother was very committed to going to this first, in my memory, huge moratorium march that was taking place on the Mall in Washington, and she wanted to bring all 3 of us kids. I think I was probably about 11.
How did your dad feel about this?
Dad was against this. He was still supporting the war, and he didn't want his children there, and he was worried about us all going. In the end, his view was starting to soften. And partly, I think, because it was the first time there was ever really television coverage of the Vietnam War. Every night on the 6 o'clock evening news with Walter Cronkite, they showed footage of fields being blown up and soldiers being killed and young Vietnamese women and children being napalmed. And this began to really disturb him. He had a hard time during World War II and was subjected to a lot of violence in the artillery. And I think this brought back a lot of memories that were really hard for him. And he began to turn a little bit against the war, and eventually he relented. And my mother took myself and my middle brother, who was about 14 at the time, to Washington. We took a bus down with some community organizers. And I remember the scene that was just wall-to-wall people protesting the war, chanting, "No way LBJ," and all sorts of anti-war slogans. And I remember thinking, gee, this many people are against this war. And I started to take on the views of my parents, my mother. Although I was only 11 or 12, I wasn't that politically active. I began to become very interested. I think especially as my dad's view softened and there started to be a little bit more agreement in the house. And my oldest brother and my cousin, who were only 2 weeks apart in age, became eligible for the draft.
How did the household dynamic change once they became eligible?
Well, there's a lot more fear. I think my father realized at that point that he didn't really want his son going off to fight in this undeclared war. And my cousin, who had some physical problems, he had Crohn's disease, got deferment and I don't remember what it was called. It was a 2-something. At the time, the way it worked, it was a draft lottery, and your birthday was entered into this lottery, and your draft assignment number was picked by the birthday. So it was luck of the draw whether you'd have a low number, which meant you would be sent, or a very, very high number, which meant that you would be less likely to be sent. My cousin Alan was given a deferment for his medical conditions. However, my brother was a healthy young 18-year-old, and I remember in October of that year when he had to register for the draft, how tearful my mother was that day and how worried she was, and how there was a lot of talk in the house of my brother going to Canada to escape the draft if, in fact, his number was low and he was called up.
Was that a common thing that people did? Flee to Canada?
Well, in the community that I lived in, there was a lot of talk about it. This was a suburb of New York City, where, not unlike Weston or Newton, where people were fairly educated and they wanted their kids to go to college and get degrees. And unfortunately, for a while there was something called the student deferment. If you were a college student, you could avoid going into the draft, which was unfair, of course, because all those people that couldn't afford to go to college or weren't getting an education were the ones that were sent into the Army. And that was a big issue for my parents also, because they felt like that was also unfair. They felt that everyone should be equal in their responsibility. However, they did not want my brother to go to Vietnam, and there was no logical reason why he shouldn't in terms of the Army. So people were talking about running to other countries, and Canada was the first one that everyone thought about running to. The media coverage of the war, I think, is really what brought the intensity of it home. Every night we were watching television, and the news channels showed footage of war, violence, injuries, helicopters swooping down, and medics, of young children. I have this really clear memory of young children being set aflame by napalm bombs. And I think as we watched this footage, it brought the carnage right into your living room, which I think was really different than other wars. You might have seen newsreels. I have a vague memory of newsreels prior to this, but I'm sure with the Korean War there were newsreels, but I was very young then, not born. But here was daily footage that we saw. It's like the immediacy of war was there. And I think that that's really what turned the tide for my dad. I think it was going on and on. American lives were being lost. We didn't know really why we were doing this, other than the name of democracy. It was clear that the war was also spilling over into Cambodia and to Laos. So all of Southeast Asia was in terrible state. And I think the violence, the raw violence, really struck us all very hard. I remember when my brother was assigned his draft number.
Which brother?
This is my oldest brother, Barry. And he was a senior in high school and was given his draft number. And as I said before, you were assigned a number based on your birthday. And so there were 365 numbers, and they just chose your birth date, and they...
There are more than 365 numbers.
No, 365 days in the year.
Yeah, but more than one person had the same birthday.
No, everyone on that birthday got chosen together.
Oh.